Some folks spend their whole lives chasing dreams that never come true. Others, like Jeb Calloway, learn to find peace in the simple blessing of a loyal dog and a roof that keeps out the rain. At 68, this mountain man had settled into his quiet life in Colorado, with his hound Buck by his side. When his estranged brother passed away, leaving behind the old family mine, Jeb figured it was just more junk to deal with. The mine had been worthless for decades, but one morning, Buck started digging in a forgotten corner of the mine shaft. What that faithful dog uncovered changed everything. Hidden beneath years of dust and neglect was a secret worth $2 million. Now everyone in town wants a piece of what Jeb never knew he had. But when greedy folks come calling, how does an old man protect a fortune he never asked for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the canyon walls like old memories, thick and slow to fade. Jeb Calloway stood on his cabin's crooked porch, watching the sun paint the Colorado peaks in shades of gold and amber. His weathered hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, the same one he'd used for the better part of 2 decades. The coffee was black and strong, the way his father had taught him to make it back when the world seemed simpler and a man's words still meant something. Buck lay, stretched across the wooden planks at Jeb's feet, his graying muzzle resting on massive paws. The old blue-tick coonhound had been his constant companion for 9 years now, ever since Jeb found him as a scrawny pup abandoned at the base of Widow's Peak. Time had silvered both their faces, but Buck's dark eyes still held the same intelligence and loyalty that had drawn Jeb to him from the start. The faded family photograph tucked behind the kitchen window caught the morning light, its edges curled with age and mountain humidity. In it, 2 young men stood proudly beside a mining cart, their faces bright with possibility and dreams. Jeb barely recognized himself in that eager 20-something standing shoulder to shoulder with his brother Marcus. They'd been inseparable, then partners in every scheme and adventure that mountain life could offer. That was before the arguments started, before Marcus grew restless with their father's traditional ways and Jeb's contentment with simple mountain living, before the harsh words that drove Marcus down to Denver, chasing bigger dreams and leaving Jeb to tend the family land alone. 43 years, Jeb murmured to Buck, who lifted his head at the sound of his master's voice. 43 years since I last spoke to that stubborn fool. The news of Marcus's death had come 3 weeks ago, delivered by a lawyer from Denver who drove up the winding mountain road in a car that had no business navigating these rough trails. Heart attack, the man had said, quick and sudden the way Marcus had always lived his life. The lawyer had handed Jeb a manila envelope containing the deed to the old Calloway mine, some legal papers, and a brief note in Marcus's familiar scrawl. Maybe you can make something of this old hole in the ground. I never could. Jeb had folded the papers without reading them thoroughly and set them on his kitchen table, where they'd remained untouched for weeks. What was the point? The Calloway mine had been played out since their grandfather's time. 3 generations of men had pulled every nugget of gold and useful ore from those tunnels, leaving behind nothing but empty shafts and broken equipment. The mine sat about 2 miles east of Jeb's cabin, carved into the face of Eagle's Rest Mountain. Their great-grandfather had staked the claim in 1889, following a vein of gold that had made the family modestly prosperous for about 15 years. But like most mining operations in these parts, the easy pickings had been exhausted by the 1920s, and subsequent generations had tried unsuccessfully to revive the operation. Jeb's routine hadn't changed much over the years. He rose with the sun, fed Buck, and spent his mornings checking his small vegetable garden and the handful of chickens that provided eggs and the occasional Sunday dinner. Afternoons were for maintenance, fixing whatever the mountain weather had damaged, chopping wood for the winter months, or walking the deer trails that crisscrossed his property. The nearest town, Cedar Ridge, lay 12 miles down a winding dirt road that became impassable during heavy snow. It wasn't much of a town. A general store, a post office, a diner that served adequate coffee and excellent pie, and about 300 souls who'd chosen to live far from the complications of modern life. Sarah Chen ran the general store with the practical efficiency of someone who understood that customer service in a small mountain community meant knowing everyone's name and their particular needs. She'd been asking about Jeb's health lately, noticing that he'd been coming to town less frequently and that his grocery purchases had grown smaller. "You eating enough up there, Jeb?" she'd asked during his last visit. "Buck looks fine, but you're getting a bit thin." Sheriff Tom Rodriguez had known Jeb for over 20 years, ever since Tom had taken the job as Cedar Ridge's only law enforcement officer. He was a good man who understood that keeping the peace in mountain country meant being part counselor, part mediator, and only occasionally part lawman. Tom had stopped by the cabin the day after the lawyer's visit, ostensibly to check on Jeb, but really to make sure the old man wasn't taking his brother's death too hard. "Marcus made his choices," Tom had said, settling into the spare chair on Jeb's porch. "You made yours. Both of you lived the lives you wanted." At the Cedar Ridge Community Bank, old Henry Watkins had been handling the financial affairs of mountain families for 40 years. He'd known both Calloway brothers since they were boys, had watched their father struggle to keep the mine profitable, and had eventually helped Jeb secure the small loan that bought his cabin and 20 acres when he decided to give up mining for good. The mountain community had its rhythms and traditions. Neighbors helped neighbors during hard times, shared resources during harsh winters, and generally minded their own business unless invited to do otherwise. It was a place where a man's reputation mattered more than his bank account, where handshake agreements still held weight, and where folks understood that sometimes the best thing you could do for a grieving friend was to leave him alone with his thoughts. Jeb had built a good life in these mountains. His cabin was small but solid, with thick log walls that kept out the winter wind and a stone fireplace that provided warmth and comfort during the long, snowy months. He'd installed solar panels 5 years ago, a concession to practicality that allowed him to keep a few modern conveniences without relying on the power company's unreliable service to remote areas. His vegetable garden produced enough food to supplement what he bought in town, and he'd become skilled at preserving vegetables and meat for winter consumption. The chickens provided fresh eggs, and he occasionally traded surplus eggs and vegetables with neighbors for services or goods he couldn't produce himself. Buck had adapted to mountain life as if he'd been born to it. The dog's hunting instincts were sharp, and he'd learned to track deer, alert Jeb to the presence of bears or mountain lions, and distinguish between familiar and unfamiliar sounds in the night. More than a working dog, Buck had become Jeb's closest friend and most trusted companion. The relationship between man and dog had deepened over the years into something that approached telepathy. Buck seemed to sense Jeb's moods, offering quiet companionship during reflective moments and gentle encouragement when the weight of solitude grew heavy. In return, Jeb had learned to read Buck's subtle signals, understanding when the dog sensed wildlife, weather changes, or the rare approach of strangers. Their daily walks had become a form of meditation for both of them. They'd follow the same general routes, up the ridge behind the cabin to check the weather and survey the valley below, down to the creek that provided fresh water and served as Buck's favorite swimming hole, or along the old mining road that connected Jeb's property to the abandoned Calloway mine. It was during one of these routine walks that Jeb had first noticed Buck's increased interest in the mine area. The dog had always been curious about the old tunnels and equipment, but lately he'd been spending more time sniffing around the entrance, pawing at loose rocks, and whining softly, as if trying to communicate something important. Jeb had attributed Buck's behavior to the presence of small game animals that might have taken shelter in the abandoned shafts. The mine had always attracted rabbits, pack rats, and occasionally bats, providing a cool refuge during hot summer days. But Buck's interest seemed different somehow, more focused and persistent than his usual hunting behavior. The mine itself was a testament to the boom and bust cycle that had defined Colorado's mining history. The main entrance was partially collapsed, blocked by a deliberate cave-in that Jeb's father had engineered in the 1960s for safety reasons. But several smaller entrances remained accessible, leading to side tunnels and storage areas that had been carved out during the mine's more productive years. Old equipment lay scattered around the site: rusted ore carts, broken timber supports, coils of cable that had long since succumbed to weather and time. A small building that had once served as an office and equipment storage facility still stood, though its roof leaked and its wooden walls had warped with decades of exposure to mountain weather. For Jeb, the mine represented both family history and family disappointment. It was the source of the Calloway family's brief prosperity and the cause of countless arguments and failed dreams. His father had spent 30 years trying to revive the operation, investing money the family couldn't afford to lose and clinging to the hope that one more tunnel, one more blast, would reveal the mother lode that would restore their fortune. Marcus had inherited their father's optimism and restlessness, but not his patience. He'd wanted to modernize the operation, bring in heavy equipment, maybe even partner with one of the big mining companies that were beginning to explore Colorado's mountains for new deposits. When Jeb had argued for a more cautious approach, preferring to work the existing tunnels more thoroughly before expanding, the brothers had clashed repeatedly. The final argument had been particularly bitter. Marcus had accused Jeb of lacking ambition and vision, of being content with mediocrity when they had the opportunity to build something significant. Jeb had countered that Marcus was more interested in getting rich quick than in preserving the family legacy, that he was willing to risk everything for a chance at striking it big. "You'll spend your whole life in these mountains," Marcus had said, his voice heavy with frustration and disappointment. 20 years from now, you'll still be scratching around in played-out tunnels, too scared to take a real risk. "And you'll spend your whole life chasing dreams that don't exist," Jeb had replied. "At least, I'll still have a home when the dreaming stops." Those words had proved prophetic in ways that gave Jeb no satisfaction. Marcus had left for Denver the next day, eventually finding work in construction and real estate development. He'd built a successful business, married a woman Jeb had never met, and created a life that had no room for mountain memories or family reconciliation. Now, Marcus was gone, and the mine was Jeb's responsibility once again. The irony wasn't lost on him. At 68, he was inheriting the same burden that had driven his brother away and divided their family for 4 decades. Standing on his porch in the morning light, watching Buck stretch and prepare for their daily walk, Jeb felt the weight of unfinished business settling on his shoulders. Maybe it was time to visit the mine again, to see what Marcus had left behind and decide what, if anything, should be done with the family's oldest legacy. 3 days later, Jeb found himself standing at the entrance to the Calloway mine, holding Marcus's rusted keyring and feeling like he was about to disturb a grave. Buck circled the area with unusual energy, his nose working overtime as he investigated scents that seemed to fascinate him more than usual. The old padlock on the equipment. She'd surrendered to Marcus's key after some coaxing and a few choice words. The door creaked open, releasing decades of stale air mixed with the metallic smell of rusted tools and rotting wood. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the roof, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits disturbed from their long rest. Inside, the shed looked exactly as Jeb remembered from his last visit 20 years ago. Mining equipment lay scattered on rough wooden shelves, pickaxes with worn handles, coils of rope that had probably lost their strength, carbide lamps that would never light again. A small wooden desk sat in the corner, covered with papers that had yellowed with age and humidity. Jeb approached the desk with the reverence of someone visiting a shrine. These were the records his father had kept, documenting every day's work, every expense, every small hope that this would be the day they'd strike the vein that would change everything. His father's careful handwriting filled ledger after ledger, recording the mundane details of a dying dream. But underneath the old ledgers, Jeb found something unexpected. A leather portfolio that looked newer than everything else in the shed. The leather was worn but not ancient, and when he opened it, he discovered papers in Marcus's distinctive handwriting, dated just 2 years ago. Geological Survey Update. Callaway Mine Property, read the header on the top document. The pages that followed were filled with technical language that Jeb didn't fully understand, but certain phrases stood out. Lithium deposits, rare earth, minerals, estimated value, and numbers that made his hands shake as he read them. According to Marcus's notes, a geological survey company had approached him about leasing mineral rights to the Callaway property. The survey had revealed something their father and grandfather had never known. Beneath the played-out gold veins lay deposits of lithium and other minerals that had become incredibly valuable in recent years. The battery industry's explosive growth had created unprecedented demand for lithium, and the survey indicated that the Callaway mine might contain enough high-grade ore to be worth millions. Marcus had apparently been negotiating with several companies, trying to determine the best way to capitalize on this discovery. But the negotiations had stalled, according to the final entries in Marcus's notes. The mining companies wanted to buy the property outright for a fraction of its potential value, while Marcus had hoped to maintain ownership and lease mining rights for a percentage of the profits. The back and forth had dragged on for months, with Marcus growing increasingly frustrated by what he saw as lowball offers and predatory tactics. The last entry, dated just 6 months ago, revealed Marcus's final decision. They think they can wait me out, pressure me into selling cheap, but I've got time and I've got something they want. Going to sit on this until they come back with a real offer. Jeb sank into the old wooden chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what he'd just read. The worthless mine that had divided his family and consumed his father's dreams was potentially worth more money than he could imagine. And now it was his to decide what to do with. Buck's sudden barking from outside interrupted his thoughts. The dog was standing near a pile of rubble at the far end of the equipment area, pawing at the ground with intense focus. When Jeb approached, he could see that Buck had uncovered something metallic, partially buried beneath years of accumulated debris. Working together, they cleared away rocks and rotted timber until Jeb could see what had captured Buck's attention. A corner of what appeared to be a metal box or container. It took another 20 minutes of careful digging to fully expose a steel ammunition box, the kind military surplus stores sold for storing valuables. The box was locked, but one of the keys on Marcus's ring fit perfectly. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, Jeb found more documents, official survey reports, correspondence with mining companies, and detailed maps showing the exact locations of the lithium deposits. But most shocking of all was a formal offer letter from Apex Mining Corporation, dated just 3 months ago, offering Marcus $2 million for a 5-year exclusive lease on mineral rights. The letter indicated that Apex was prepared to begin mining operations immediately, with guarantees of environmental restoration and ongoing royalty payments that could extend the total value of the deal well beyond the initial $2 million. Marcus had apparently been considering the offer, based on his handwritten notes in the margins, but had died before making a final decision. At the bottom of the box, Jeb found a sealed envelope with his name written on it in Marcus's careful script. Inside was a letter that began, "Jeb, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and this mess is yours to figure out. I should have called you when I first learned about the lithium, should have swallowed my pride and asked for your help. But you know me, always thought I could handle everything myself. The letter continued. "The mine is worth more than we ever dreamed, brother. These companies are circling like vultures, and some of them aren't the kind of people you want to do business with. Apex seems legitimate, but there are others asking questions, making inquiries around town. Be careful who you trust. The money is real, but so are the dangers that come with it." Marcus's final words hit Jeb like a physical blow. "I know we said things we can't take back, but I never stopped thinking of you as my brother. I hope you can forgive a stubborn old fool who was too proud to come home. The mine is yours now. Make whatever choice feels right to you, but make it carefully. People change when this much money is involved." Jeb read the letter 3 times before the full weight of the situation settled on him. He wasn't just inheriting a worthless mine. He was inheriting a fortune that came with complications he was only beginning to understand. The brother he'd been estranged from for 4 decades had died trying to protect both the family legacy and the family fortune. Buck whined softly and pressed against Jeb's leg, sensing his master's emotional turmoil. The discovery that should have been cause for celebration felt instead like a burden that might be too heavy to carry. At 68, with a simple life he'd grown to love, Jeb now faced decisions that would affect not just his own future, but potentially the future of everyone in the small mountain community. As the afternoon sun slanted through the gaps in the shed roof, Jeb carefully returned the documents to their protective containers. The metal box went back into its hiding place, covered once again with rocks and debris, but the knowledge of what lay beneath his feet couldn't be buried so easily. Walking back to his cabin with Buck trotting beside him, Jeb felt the weight of $2 million in unanswered questions. How long before the mining companies learned of Marcus's death and came looking for the new owner? How many other people knew about the lithium deposits? And most troubling of all, what kind of dangers had Marcus been worried about in his final months? That evening, as Jeb sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of red and gold, he made his first decision. Tomorrow, he would drive to Cedar Ridge and have a conversation with Sheriff Rodriguez. If trouble was coming to his mountain, he wanted law enforcement to know what they might be dealing with. But tonight, he would simply sit with Buck and try to reconcile the peaceful life he'd built with the complicated inheritance that threatened to change everything. Sometimes, Jeb reflected, getting what you never knew you wanted could be the most dangerous blessing of all. The drive to Cedar Ridge the next morning felt longer than usual, weighed down by the secrets Jeb carried and the decisions he knew he couldn't postpone much longer. Buck rode shotgun, his head hanging out the window as the old pickup truck navigated. The winding mountain road, the familiar rhythm of the drive usually calmed Jeb's mind, but today his thoughts churned like storm clouds gathering over the peaks. Sheriff Tom Rodriguez was watering the small garden behind the sheriff's office when Jeb pulled up. Tom had always been a practical man who believed that growing your own tomatoes was just as important as keeping the peace. He looked up with a welcoming smile that faded slightly when he saw the serious expression on Jeb's face. "Morning, Jeb. You look like a man with something heavy on his mind." "That I do, Tom. You got a few minutes to talk privately?" Tom set down his watering can and gestured toward the office. "Coffee's fresh and the air conditioning actually works today. Come on in." Inside the small office, Jeb found himself staring at a wall covered with maps of the county, notices from the state police, and a few faded photographs of local events. Tom poured 2 cups of coffee and settled behind his desk, his expression patient but attentive. "This is about Marcus's inheritance, isn't it?" Tom said after Jeb had struggled to find the right words for several minutes. Jeb nodded slowly. "Tom, what I'm about to tell you needs to stay between us until I figure out what to do, but I need someone in law enforcement to know what might be coming our way." Over the next 20 minutes, Jeb carefully explained everything he'd discovered. At the mine, he showed Tom copies of the geological survey, the correspondence with mining companies, and Marcus's warning letter. Tom listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When Jeb finished, Tom leaned back in his chair and whistled softly. $2 million. That's more money than most folks in this county will see in their entire lives. The money's just the beginning of the problem, Jeb said. Marcus was worried about something, and his letter mentioned people who aren't the kind you want to do business with. I'm thinking that means trouble could be headed our way. Tom studied the documents again, paying particular attention to the list of companies that had made inquiries about the property. I recognize some of these names. Apex Mining has a decent reputation, but a couple of these others have been involved in some questionable deals in other states. Nothing criminal that I know of, but they play hardball when they want something. The artifact that had emerged from this conversation was Marcus's warning letter itself, a document that would prove to be more prophetic than either man realized. The letter represented not just a brother's final communication, but a roadmap to the dangers that lay ahead. What are you thinking of doing? Tom asked. Jeb had been wrestling with that question all night. Honestly, Tom, I'm not sure I want any part of this. I've got a good life up on the mountain. Don't need millions of dollars to complicate things. But walking away might not be an option, Tom pointed out. Once word gets out that there's lithium on your property, people are going to come calling whether you want them to or not. Might be better to deal with this on your own terms. Before Jeb could respond, the office door opened and Sarah Chen walked in, carrying a box of supplies for the office coffee station. She paused when she saw the serious expressions on both men's faces. Sorry to interrupt. Should I come back later? Tom glanced at Jeb, who nodded slightly. Actually, Sarah, this might concern you too. Jeb's discovered something that could affect the whole community. Sarah set down her box and took the offered chair next to Jeb. As a business owner who'd lived in Cedar Ridge for 15 years, she'd earned the trust and respect of everyone in town. If trouble was coming, she'd be one of the people who'd have to deal with the consequences. Jeb found himself telling the story again, watching Sarah's expression change from curiosity to concern to something approaching alarm. Mining companies, she said when he finished. That means trucks, equipment, workers, probably a temporary camp. It could completely change the character of our community. That's if Jeb decides to lease the mineral rights, Tom said. He's got other options. Do I? Jeb asked. Because Marcus's letter makes it sound like some of these companies aren't going to take no for an answer. Sarah had dealt with her share of difficult customers and aggressive salespeople over the years. Her practical experience had taught her to recognize when someone was trying to pressure or manipulate a situation. What about getting your own expert advice? She suggested. There have to be lawyers and consultants who specialize in this kind of thing. People who can help you understand all your options before you make any decisions. It was sound advice, but Jeb felt overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. 3 days ago, his biggest decision had been whether to plant beans or squash in the back corner of his garden. Now he was facing choices that involved millions of dollars and potentially dangerous people. There's something else, Tom said, pulling out a folder from his desk drawer. I got a call yesterday from a sheriff down in Gunnison County. They've had some incidents with mining company representatives getting a little too aggressive in their negotiating tactics. Nothing criminal, but enough to make local landowners uncomfortable. He handed Jeb a report that described several cases where property owners had been pressured to sell or lease mineral rights through tactics that bordered on harassment. Late-night phone calls, unexpected visits, pressure on family members, and veiled threats about the consequences of refusing to cooperate. The companies involved claimed these were overzealous employees acting without authorization, Tom continued. But the pattern was consistent enough to raise some red flags. Jeb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office air conditioning. You think that could happen here? I think Marcus was smart to be cautious, Tom replied. And I think You need to be prepared for the possibility that people are going to start showing up, asking questions. As if summoned by their conversation, the office phone rang. Tom answered with his usual professional greeting, but his expression grew increasingly serious as he listened to the caller. I see. When did they arrive? Uh-huh. No, that's fine. I'll be in touch. He hung up and looked at Jeb with concern. That was Helen at the motel. She's got 3 men checked in who arrived this morning asking questions about mining properties in the area. They're specifically interested in the old Callaway mine. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Word was already spreading, faster than Jeb had hoped and sooner than he'd expected. Could be a coincidence, Sarah said, though her tone suggested she didn't believe it. Could be, Tom agreed. But I don't believe in coincidences when this much money is involved. Jeb stood up, suddenly feeling the need to get back to his mountain and check on his property. Tom, I need you to keep an eye on things here in town. If these men start asking questions about me specifically, I want to know about it. You got it. But Jeb, don't try to handle this alone. If you need help, call me day or night. As Jeb prepared to leave, Sarah touched his arm gently. Whatever you decide to do, don't let anyone pressure you into making a quick decision. This is your property, your family's legacy. You take all the time you need to figure out what's right for you. The drive back up the mountain felt different, now charged with new urgency and awareness. Jeb found himself checking his mirrors more frequently, looking for signs that he might be followed. Buck seemed to sense his master's increased tension, sitting more alertly and occasionally whining softly. Back at the cabin, Jeb spent the afternoon reviewing the documents again, trying to understand all the technical details and legal implications. The geological survey was thorough, but written in language that required expertise he didn't possess. The correspondence with mining companies revealed a complex web of offers, counter-offers, and negotiations that had apparently frustrated Marcus enough to make him consider walking away from the entire deal. But it was the warning letter that kept drawing Jeb's attention. Marcus had been specific about his concerns, mentioning people you don't want to do business with and dangers that come with it. What had his brother discovered during those months of negotiations? What had made him so cautious about proceeding? As evening approached, Jeb made his second major decision. Tomorrow, he would contact the law firm in Denver that had handled Marcus's estate. They might be able to recommend someone who specialized in mineral rights and mining contracts. If he was going to make informed decisions about his future, he needed expert guidance he could trust. But tonight, he would prepare for the possibility that visitors might come calling sooner than he'd hoped. The shotgun in his bedroom closet was cleaned and loaded, and Buck would provide early warning if anyone approached the cabin after dark. Sometimes, Jeb reflected as he watched the sun set behind the peaks, inheriting a fortune felt more like inheriting a war. The phone call came at 7:30 the next morning, just as Jeb was finishing his first cup of coffee. The landline's shrill ring cut through the mountain, quiet like a blade, causing Buck to lift his head from his favorite spot by the fireplace. Mr. Callaway, this is David Chen from Apex Mining Corporation. I believe we had some preliminary discussions with your brother Marcus about mineral rights on your property. Jeb's grip tightened on the receiver. He'd expected this call, but hearing it still sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system. Marcus is dead, Mr. Chen. Has been for 3 weeks now. Yes, sir. I'm aware of that, and please accept my condolences. Your brother was a sharp negotiator and a good man. I'm calling because our offer still stands, and I'd like to discuss how we might move forward. The smooth professionalism in Chen's voice set Jeb on edge. There was something too polished about it, too prepared, as if this conversation had been rehearsed. I'm not ready to discuss anything yet, Jeb said, still going through Marcus's papers, trying to understand what he was working on. Of course, I understand completely. These things take time. But, Mr. Callaway, I should mention that time might be a factor here. The lithium market is very volatile right now, and prices that are attractive today might not be available indefinitely. There it was, the first hint of pressure disguised as helpful advice. Jeb had dealt with enough salespeople over the years to recognize the tactic. "Mr. Chen, I appreciate your call, but I'm not making any decisions until I've had time to review everything properly. When I'm ready to talk, I'll be in touch." Certainly, but perhaps I could drive up and at least introduce myself. "I'm actually in the area this week, staying at the Cedar Ridge Motel. It would be no trouble to stop by and answer any questions you might have." Jeb felt the walls closing in. Chen was already in town, already positioning himself for a face-to-face meeting that Jeb wasn't prepared for. "Not this week, Mr. Chen. I'll call you when I'm ready." After hanging up, Jeb sat in his kitchen, staring at the phone as if it might ring again at any moment. The artifact that was beginning to dominate his thoughts was Marcus's business card holder, a leather case he'd found in the ammunition box containing cards from dozens of mining companies, lawyers, and consultants. Each card represented someone who wanted something from the Calloway family, and now they'd all be calling him. Buck wandered over and rested his massive head on Jeb's knee, offering the silent comfort that had sustained their friendship for 9 years. The dog's presence reminded Jeb that whatever decisions he made would affect not just his own life, but the simple, peaceful existence they'd built together on this mountain. 20 minutes later, the phone rang again. "Mr. Calloway, this is Janet Morrison from Mountain States Geological Services. We did the original survey work on your property, and I wanted to reach out personally to offer our continued services during this transition period." This time, Jeb was ready. "Ms. Morrison, I'm going to stop you right there. I'm not taking business calls this week. I'll contact people when I'm ready to discuss my options." "I completely understand, Mr. Calloway, but I feel obligated to mention that there are companies operating in your area that don't always have landowners' best interests at heart. If you need independent verification of survey data or contract review, we're here to help." The warning was subtle but clear. Morrison was suggesting that some of the other players in this game might not be trustworthy, while positioning her company as the reliable alternative. "I'll keep that in mind," Jeb said and hung up. By noon, he'd received 6 more calls, 3 from mining companies, 2 from law firms specializing in mineral rights, and 1 from a man who claimed to represent interested investors but was vague about what company he worked for. Each caller knew about Marcus's death, each had detailed knowledge of the lithium deposits, and each wanted to schedule a meeting as soon as possible. The pressure was building faster than Jeb had anticipated. Word of the discovery was spreading through industry networks like wildfire, and everyone wanted to be first in line to make a deal. Around 2 o'clock, Jeb decided he needed advice from someone he trusted. He loaded Buck into the truck and headed back to Cedar Ridge, this time to visit Henry Watkins at the bank. If anyone in town understood the financial implications of his situation, it would be Henry. The Cedar Ridge Community Bank occupied a small brick building that had been constructed in the 1920s, when the town still harbored hopes of becoming a significant commercial center. Henry had worked there for 40 years, starting as a teller and eventually becoming president when the previous owner retired. Henry's office was filled with the comfortable clutter of a man who'd spent decades helping mountain families navigate financial challenges. Pictures of local families covered one wall, mixed with certificates and awards, recognizing his service to the community. "Jeb, good to see you. Heard you've been getting some phone calls today." "Word travels fast in a small town," Jeb said, settling into the worn leather chair across from Henry's desk. "Sarah Chen mentioned that you'd discovered something significant at the mine. She didn't give me details, but she suggested you might need some financial advice." Jeb found himself telling the story for the 3rd time in 2 days, watching Henry's expression grow increasingly serious as the implications became clear. $2 million, Henry said when Jeb finished. "That's more than this bank handles in a typical year. Jeb, I have to tell you, this puts you in a category where you need expertise I can't provide." Henry pulled out a business card from his desk drawer. This is Margaret Sullivan. She's a lawyer in Denver who specializes in mineral rights and large-scale land deals. I've never worked with her personally, but she's got an excellent reputation, and she's not connected to any of the mining companies. The card felt substantial in Jeb's hand, like a lifeline in turbulent waters. You think I need a lawyer? I think you need someone who understands this business better than anyone in Cedar Ridge does, Henry said. These companies have teams of lawyers, geologists, and negotiators. You shouldn't be facing them alone. As they talked, Henry explained the potential tax implications of a $2 million transaction, the various ways such deals could be structured, and the importance of understanding every clause in any contract before signing. The other thing to consider, Henry said, is what this kind of money might do to your life. Are you prepared for that level of wealth? Do you want it? It was a question that cut to the heart of Jeb's dilemma. He'd spent 68 years learning to find contentment in simplicity. The idea of suddenly becoming wealthy felt as foreign and threatening as the phone calls from strangers who wanted to reshape his world. I keep thinking about what Marcus went through, Jeb said. All those months of negotiations, all that stress and worry. Maybe that's what killed him. Or maybe he was trying to protect something that mattered to him, Henry suggested. Your family's land, your heritage, your right to make decisions on your own terms. As Jeb prepared to leave, Henry offered one final piece of advice. Whatever you decide, don't let anyone rush you. This is your property, your choice, your timeline. Anyone who tries to pressure you into a quick decision probably isn't someone you want to do business with. The drive home gave Jeb time to process the day's conversations and phone calls. The mining companies were circling like vultures, but there were also people offering legitimate help and guidance. The challenge would be learning to distinguish between the two. Back at the cabin, Jeb spent the evening reading through Marcus's correspondence more carefully, paying particular attention to his brother's notes about the various companies and individuals he'd dealt with. A pattern was beginning to emerge. Some companies had been respectful and patient, others had been aggressive and demanding. Apex Mining fell somewhere in the middle, but Marcus's notes suggested he'd grown increasingly uncomfortable with their tactics as negotiations progressed. There were references to pressure tactics and veiled threats, though Marcus hadn't been specific about what those threats involved. As night fell over the mountains, Jeb made his third major decision. Tomorrow, he would call Margaret Sullivan and ask her to review Marcus's files. If he was going to navigate these treacherous waters, he needed someone who understood the currents and knew how to avoid the rocks. But tonight, he would simply sit with Buck and try to hold on to the peace he'd worked so hard to build. Whatever storms were coming, he wanted to remember what he was fighting to protect. Margaret Sullivan's voice carried the confidence of someone who'd spent 20 years fighting battles in corporate boardrooms and courthouses. When Jeb called her office the next morning, she listened to his situation without interruption, asking pointed questions that revealed both her expertise and her understanding of the pressures he was facing. Mr. Calloway, based on what you've described, you're sitting on one of the most significant lithium deposits discovered in Colorado in the past decade. That makes you very valuable to a lot of people, but it also makes you a target. A target for what? For every trick, pressure tactic, and legal maneuver that companies use when they want something badly enough. I've seen cases where landowners were sued on trumped-up charges, had their property titles challenged, or faced harassment campaigns designed to make their lives so difficult they'd sell just to make it stop. The artifact that emerged from this conversation was Margaret's initial retainer agreement, a document that would become Jeb's shield against the legal and financial complexities ahead. But more than just a contract, it represented his first step toward fighting back instead of simply reacting to pressure. I can drive up this afternoon if you're available, Margaret continued. I'd like to review your brother's files in person and get a better sense of the situation. Fair warning, my initial consultation fee is $1,500, and if you decide to retain my services, we're looking at a significant investment. The money gave Jeb pause, but Henry's advice echoed in his mind. He was facing opponents with unlimited resources and legal teams. He couldn't afford to go into this battle unarmed. "Come on up, Miss Sullivan. I'll have the files ready." After hanging up, Jeb spent the morning organizing Marcus's documents and preparing for what felt like the most important business meeting of his life. Buck seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, staying close to Jeb's side and occasionally whining softly when the stress became too apparent. Around 11 o'clock, Sheriff Rodriguez called with disturbing news. "Jeb, those 3 men at the motel have been asking a lot of questions around town. They've talked to Sarah, Henry, even old Mrs. Patterson at the post office. They're specifically asking about your habits, your schedule, whether you live alone up there." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that make me think they're gathering intelligence rather than just doing business research. Mrs. Patterson said one of them asked if you had any family nearby, any regular visitors. That's not the kind of information mining companies typically need." Jeb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You think they're planning something?" "I think they're trying to figure out how vulnerable you are, how much pressure they can apply before you break. The good news is that everyone in town has been giving them the same answer, that you're a private man who keeps to himself and doesn't appreciate uninvited visitors. Tom, I've got a lawyer coming up this afternoon to look at Marcus's files. Can you keep an eye on things while she's here?" "Absolutely. In fact, I might just happen to be patrolling the road near your place." Around that time, Margaret Sullivan arrived precisely on time, driving a silver SUV that looked capable of handling mountain roads, but expensive enough to announce that she was successful at what she did. She was younger than Jeb had expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of focused energy that came from years of high-stakes negotiations. Buck took an immediate liking to her, which Jeb considered a good sign. His dog had always been an excellent judge of character. "Impressive setup you have here, Mr. Calloway," Margaret said as she surveyed the cabin and the surrounding landscape. "I can see why you wouldn't want to leave this for city life." Over the next 3 hours, Margaret reviewed every document in Marcus's files, taking detailed notes and occasionally asking questions that revealed just how complex the situation had become. "Your brother was smart to be cautious," she said finally. "Some of these companies have reputations that would make me very nervous. But he also left some opportunities on the table by being too suspicious." She spread several documents across Jeb's kitchen table, creating a visual map of the various offers and negotiations. Apex Mining's offer is legitimate, but it's also about 30% below market value. They're counting on you, not knowing what this deposit is really worth. This offer from Consolidated Minerals is higher, but their contract terms are terrible. They'd basically own your land for the next 20 years. Margaret pointed to a third set of documents. "Now this one is interesting. Rocky Mountain Resource Partners made an offer that your brother apparently dismissed out of hand, but they're actually proposing a joint venture structure that would let you maintain ownership while sharing in the profits. The numbers are much better, and the terms protect your interests. Why did Marcus dismiss it? According to his notes, he didn't trust them because they were a smaller company. But sometimes smaller companies offer better deals because they need to compete with the big players." As Margaret explained the various options, Jeb began to understand the complexity of the decision he faced. This wasn't just about accepting or rejecting a single offer. It was about choosing between different visions of his future and different levels of risk and reward. "What would you recommend?" Jeb asked. "I'd recommend getting an independent geological survey to verify the value of the deposit, then using that information to negotiate with the most promising companies." "But Mr. Calloway, I have to ask, do you actually want this money? Because if you don't, there are ways to structure a deal." That would minimize the impact on your lifestyle. It was the same question Henry had asked, and Jeb still didn't have a clear answer. I keep thinking about Marcus, about how this whole business consumed the last 2 years of his life. I don't want that to happen to me. It doesn't have to. The key is maintaining control of the process instead of letting the process control you. You set the timeline, you choose who to negotiate with, you decide what you're willing to accept. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching on the mountain road. Through the window, Jeb could see 2 black SUVs making their way up the winding path to his cabin. "Expecting company?" Margaret asked, her tone shifting to professional alertness. "No, and very few people know this road." Buck was already at the door, his hackles raised and a low growl rumbling in his throat. The vehicle stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, and 4 men in expensive suits climbed out. Even from a distance, Jeb could see that these weren't the kind of visitors who came calling with good intentions. Margaret was already reaching for her cell phone. "I'm calling Sheriff Rodriguez. These men have no business being on your property uninvited." As the men approached the cabin, their leader, a tall man with silver hair and cold eyes, called out in a voice that carried false friendliness, "Mr. Calloway, my name is Vincent Reese. I represent some investors who are very interested in discussing your mineral rights. Could we have a few minutes of your time?" Jeb stepped onto his porch, with Buck flanking him and Margaret visible through the screen door. "Mr. Reese, this is private property, and you're trespassing. I didn't invite you here, and I don't do business with people who show up uninvited." Reese's smile never wavered, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "I think there's been a misunderstanding, Mr. Calloway. We're not here to cause trouble. We're here to make you a very generous offer for something that could become quite problematic if not handled properly." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Margaret stepped onto the porch beside Jeb, her presence changing the dynamics of the confrontation. "Gentlemen, I'm Mr. Calloway's attorney, and I'm advising him not to speak with you without proper legal representation and advance scheduling. You need to leave his property immediately." Reese's attention shifted to Margaret, and Jeb didn't like what he saw in the man's expression. This was someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and pressure. "Ms. Sullivan, and I'm telling you again, leave now, or I'll have you arrested for trespassing." The standoff lasted another tense minute before Reese nodded to his companions. "Mr. Calloway, I hope you'll reconsider. The mining business can be unpredictable, and it's always better to work with people who understand how to protect your interests." As the men returned to their vehicles, Jeb noticed that one of them had been taking photographs of the cabin, the surrounding area, and the access road. They were gathering intelligence, just as Sheriff Rodriguez had suspected. Margaret waited until the SUVs had disappeared down the mountain before speaking. "Mr. Calloway, this situation just became much more serious. Those men weren't from a legitimate mining company. They were conducting reconnaissance. Reconnaissance for what? For whatever they're planning next. And based on 30 years of experience in this business, I can tell you that what comes next probably won't be pleasant." Sheriff Rodriguez arrived 20 minutes after Margaret's call, his cruiser kicking up dust as he navigated the mountain road with practiced efficiency. His expression was grim as he listened to their account of Reese's visit, taking detailed notes and asking pointed questions about the men's behavior and vehicles. "Vincent Reese," Tom repeated, writing the name in his incident report. "I'll run a background check, but I'm betting he's not going to show up in any legitimate business directories." Margaret had remained at the cabin to provide legal context for the incident. "Sheriff, based on my experience with similar cases, this was a reconnaissance mission. They wanted to assess Mr. Calloway's vulnerabilities. How isolated he is, what kind of security he has, whether he's got people looking out for him. Security cameras would be a good investment," Tom suggested. "And Jeb, I think it's time you considered staying in town for a few days, at least until we figure out who these people are and what they want." The suggestion struck at the heart of Jeb's dilemma. His mountain cabin wasn't just his home. It was his sanctuary, the place where he'd found peace after years of family turmoil and personal struggles. The idea of being driven from it by threats and intimidation felt like a fundamental violation of everything he'd worked to build. "I'm not running from my own land," Jeb said firmly. "If they want to escalate this, we'll deal with it here." Margaret exchanged a glance with Sheriff Rodriguez. "Mr. Calloway, I understand the principle, but we're talking about your safety. These people clearly have resources and aren't constrained by normal business ethics." The artifact that emerged from this tense discussion was Tom's incident report, a document that would become the first official record of the harassment campaign against Jeb. But more than just paperwork, it represented the moment when the situation moved from private business negotiations to potential criminal activity. After Tom left to begin his investigation, Margaret helped Jeb develop a strategy for dealing with the escalating pressure. They spent the evening reviewing his options, from accepting one of the legitimate offers to fighting any attempts to force him off his land. "The key is to take control of the narrative," Margaret explained. "Right now, these companies think they're dealing with an isolated old man who can be intimidated into selling cheap. We need to change that perception." Margaret's plan was both simple and sophisticated. First, they would commission an independent geological survey to establish the true value of the lithium deposits. This would give Jeb leverage in any negotiations and prevent companies from lowballing him based on Marcus's older data. Second, they would reach out to several legitimate mining companies and invite them to submit formal proposals under controlled conditions. This would create competition and drive up offers while establishing that Jeb was serious about doing business, just not under duress. Finally, they would document every instance of harassment or intimidation, building a legal record that could be used to pursue criminal charges or civil remedies if the pressure tactics continued. "The goal is to make it clear that you're not an easy target," Margaret said. "Companies like the one Reese represents prey on isolated landowners who don't have resources to fight back. When they realize you're prepared to defend yourself, they usually move on to easier prey." The next morning brought both good news and troubling developments. The good news came in a call from Margaret's office. The independent geological survey team could be on site within a week, and preliminary research suggested that Marcus's estimates might actually be conservative. The troubling news came from Sheriff Rodriguez, who had completed his background check on Vincent Reese and the vehicles he'd been driving. The SUVs were rentals paid for by a shell company that traces back to a larger corporation with ties to several questionable mining operations, Tom reported over the phone. Reese himself has a record, not criminal, but he's been involved in several civil suits related to aggressive business practices. What kind of practices? Intimidation, harassment, property damage, designed to look accidental. He's smart enough to stay just on the legal side of things, but he's definitely not someone you want to underestimate. As if summoned by their conversation, the phone rang again. This time it was Sarah Chen from the general store, and her voice carried uncharacteristic tension. "Jeb, you need to know that those men have been back in town, asking more questions. But now they're asking about your routine, when you come to town for supplies, what kind of truck you drive. It's making everyone uncomfortable." The harassment was expanding beyond Jeb's property to include the entire community that had become his extended family. The thought of his problems affecting people like Sarah and Henry made him angrier than any threats against himself. That afternoon, Jeb made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. He called a meeting with the legitimate mining companies that had expressed interest in his property, scheduling back-to-back presentations for the following week. "If everyone wants to do business so badly," he told Margaret, "then they can compete for the privilege on my terms, in my time frame." Margaret approved of the strategy. It shows strength and control, Plus, having legitimate companies actively courting your business will make it much harder for the bad actors to operate in the shadows. The first company to respond was Rocky Mountain Resource Partners, the smaller firm that Marcus had dismissed. Their representative, a geologist named Dr. Elena Vasquez, expressed enthusiasm about presenting their proposal and seemed genuinely excited about the prospect of working with Jeb rather than simply buying him out. Apex Mining also confirmed their interest, though David Chen's tone had noticeably cooled since his earlier phone calls. The pressure of competition was already changing the dynamics of the negotiations, but it was the response from Consolidated Minerals that proved most revealing. Their representative, a lawyer named Patterson, asked several pointed questions about Jeb's security situation and whether there had been any incidents related to his property. "Why would that matter to your proposal?" Margaret had asked during the call. "We just want to make sure we're dealing with a stable situation," Patterson had replied. "Sometimes these remote properties can attract unwanted attention from less scrupulous operators." The comment suggested that Consolidated Minerals knew about Reese's visit, which raised uncomfortable questions about how information was flowing between the various companies interested in Jeb's property. As evening approached, Jeb found himself standing on his porch with Buck, watching the sun set behind the mountain peaks and trying to process how dramatically his life had changed in just 1 week. 7 days ago, his biggest concern had been whether to repair the chicken coop roof before winter. Now he was facing corporate espionage, harassment campaigns, and decisions that could affect his entire future. Buck pressed against his leg, offering the silent comfort that had sustained their friendship through every challenge they'd faced together. Whatever came next, Jeb realized, he wouldn't face it alone. He had Margaret's legal expertise, Sheriff Rodriguez's protection, the community support, and Buck's unwavering loyalty. But most importantly, he was beginning to understand that the real battle wasn't about money or mining rights. It was about the right to live his life on his own terms, free from intimidation and pressure from people who saw him as nothing more than an obstacle to their profits. The war for his mountain was just beginning, but Jeb Calloway was no longer the isolated, vulnerable target that his enemies had expected to find. They wanted a fight, and now they were going to get one. The Independent Geological Survey team arrived on a crisp Thursday morning, their equipment trailer and specialized vehicles creating quite a stir as they made their way up the mountain road. Dr. Michael Harrison, the team leader, was a soft-spoken man in his 50s, whose reputation for thorough, unbiased assessments had made him Margaret's first choice for the job. "Mr. Calloway, based on the preliminary data your brother collected, we should have a comprehensive assessment within 3 days, Dr. Harrison explained, as his team began setting up their equipment. "We'll be doing core samples, ground penetrating, radar and chemical analysis of existing mineral deposits." Buck watched the proceedings with intense curiosity, occasionally approaching the various machines and instruments before returning to Jeb's side. The dog seemed to understand that these strangers were different from the threatening visitors who had come before. On the second day of the survey, Dr. Harrison approached Jeb with an expression that mixed excitement with professional caution. "Mr. Calloway, we've found something unexpected. Could I show you what we've discovered?" They walked to an area about 50 yards from the main mine entrance, where the survey team had been taking core samples. Dr. Harrison pointed to a series of rock samples laid out on a portable table. "Your brother's survey data was accurate about the lithium deposits, but it appears they only scratched the surface. The geological formation extends much deeper than anyone realized, and the mineral composition is more complex than the original assessment indicated." Dr. Harrison picked up one of the rock samples, pointing to veins of different colored minerals running through it. "This isn't just lithium, Mr. Calloway. We're looking at significant deposits of cobalt, rare earth elements, and what appears to be a substantial vein of high-grade copper." The implications began to sink in, as Dr. Harrison continued his explanation. Conservatively, we're looking at a deposit worth somewhere between $8 and $12 million. But if the seam extends as far as our preliminary readings suggest, it could be worth considerably more. Jeb felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Not literally, but in every way that mattered. The $2 million secret that had already turned his life upside down was actually a much larger secret that would attract even more dangerous attention. The artifact that emerged from this revelation was Dr. Harrison's preliminary survey report, a document that would redefine everything about Jeb's situation and the stakes involved. But more than just scientific data, it represented the moment when the true scope of the Calloway family legacy became clear. Dr. Harrison, how many people know about these findings? Just my team, and now you. We haven't submitted our formal report yet, and we won't until you give us permission. But Mr. Calloway, I should warn you, news this significant has a way of leaking out despite everyone's best intentions. That evening, Jeb called Margaret with the survey results. Her response was immediate and sobering. Mr. Calloway, this changes everything. We're not talking about a significant local discovery anymore. We're talking about one of the most valuable mineral finds in Colorado history. That's going to attract attention from major corporations, international mining companies, maybe even government agencies. What does that mean for my safety? It means the people who were willing to pressure you over $2 million are going to be much more aggressive when they learn about 8 to 12 million. We need to accelerate our timeline and get you some serious protection. The next morning brought the first sign that word was already spreading. Jeb woke to find fresh tire tracks in the soft earth near his property line. Someone had been conducting surveillance during the night. Buck had been restless, pacing the cabin and occasionally growling at sounds only he could hear. Sheriff Rodriguez arrived within an hour of Jeb's call, examining the tire tracks and finding several cigarette butts near a cluster of trees that provided a clear view of the cabin. Professional surveillance, Tom concluded. They were here for several hours, probably with night vision equipment. Jeb, I'm going to insist that you consider staying in town until we can get some security measures in place up here. But before Jeb could respond, Margaret's SUV came racing up the mountain road, moving faster than was safe on the winding trail. She parked hastily and approached with an expression of barely controlled urgency. "We have a problem," she announced, without preamble. "I just got a call from a contact in Denver. Vincent Reese and his associates aren't just representing mining interests. They're working for a consortium that includes some very questionable international investors." Margaret pulled out a folder containing documents she'd received just hours earlier. Money laundering, tax evasion, environmental violations in third world countries. These people don't just ignore business ethics, they actively violate international law. Sheriff Rodriguez studied the documents with growing concern. This explains why they're not following normal negotiation protocols. They're not just trying to buy your mineral rights. They're trying to gain control of a property they can use for activities that wouldn't be legal through legitimate channels. The revelation hit Jeb like a physical blow. His peaceful mountain property wasn't just valuable for its mineral deposits. It was potentially valuable as a base for illegal operations hidden in Colorado's remote wilderness. "There's more," Margaret continued. "I've been contacted by the FBI. They've been monitoring this consortium for months as part of a larger investigation into international money laundering operations. Your property appeared on their radar when the geological survey data started circulating through industry networks. Agent Sarah Blake arrived that afternoon, driving an unmarked sedan and carrying credentials that identified her as a specialist in financial crimes. She was younger than Jeb had expected for an FBI agent, but her demeanor carried the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with serious criminals. "Mr. Calloway, I need you to understand that you've inadvertently become a target in a much larger criminal investigation. The consortium trying to acquire your property is suspected of using remote mining operations to hide money laundering activities. Agent Blake spread out a series of photographs showing mining operations in other states where the consortium had gained control. They established legitimate mining operations, then used them to move illegal money through complex equipment purchases and mineral sales. The remote locations make oversight difficult, and the mining industry's complex financial structures provide perfect cover. So they don't really care about the lithium. They care about it, but probably not for the reasons you'd expect. A $12 million mineral deposit provides perfect justification for moving much larger amounts of money through the operation. They could claim to be processing $50 million worth of minerals while actually laundering drug money or terrorism financing. The scope of what Jeb had stumbled into was staggering. His family's abandoned mine had become the center of an international criminal conspiracy, and his refusal to sell was potentially disrupting operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Agent Blake, what does this mean for my safety? It means we need to take immediate steps to protect you while we complete our investigation. These people have killed to protect smaller operations than this one. The words hung in the mountain air like a death sentence. Jeb looked around at the peaceful landscape he'd called home for decades, trying to reconcile the tranquil beauty with the deadly reality that was closing in around him. Buck whined softly and pressed against Jeb's leg, sensing the fear and tension that filled the air. Whatever decision Jeb made next would determine not just his own future, but potentially the outcome of a federal investigation that could impact criminal operations around the world. The simple mountain man who'd wanted nothing more than to live quietly with his dog had become an unwitting key player in a battle between federal law enforcement and international criminals. And the war for his mountain was about to become much more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The safe house was a modest cabin about 15 miles from Cedar Ridge, hidden in a grove of aspen trees and equipped with sophisticated security equipment that seemed incongruous with its rustic appearance. Agent Blake had insisted on moving Jeb and Buck there, while the FBI coordinated their response to the escalating threat. "This is temporary," Blake assured him as they settled into the unfamiliar surroundings. "We need time to set up surveillance at your property and coordinate with other law enforcement agencies. This consortium has tentacles reaching into several states." But Jeb felt like a prisoner in protective custody, cut off from the mountain home that had defined his identity. For decades, Buck seemed equally unsettled, pacing restlessly and occasionally whining at the door as if asking when they could return to familiar territory. The artifact that dominated this tense waiting period was Agent Blake's case file, a thick folder containing surveillance photos, financial records, and intercepted communications that revealed the true scope of the criminal organization targeting Jeb's property. Each document painted a picture of sophisticated criminals who eliminated obstacles to their operations with ruthless efficiency. Margaret visited the safe house daily, bringing updates on the legal preparations and coordinating with the FBI's strategy. The legitimate mining companies had been informed of the situation and asked to postpone their presentations until the criminal investigation was resolved. "Rocky Mountain Resource Partners is being very understanding," Margaret reported during one of her visits. "Dr. Vasquez actually offered to provide technical assistance to law enforcement if it would help resolve the situation faster. What about the others?" "Apex Mining is concerned about the security implications and wants assurances that they won't be associated with criminal activity." Consolidated Minerals withdrew their interest entirely after learning about the FBI investigation. The withdrawal of Consolidated Minerals raised red flags for Agent Blake, who suspected the company might have connections to the criminal consortium. "Companies with clean records don't usually run away from law enforcement cooperation," she observed. "We're adding them to our investigation list." On the third day at the safe house, Agent Blake received a call that changed the dynamics of the entire situation. The FBI's surveillance team at Jebb's property had observed Vincent Reese and his associates conducting what appeared to be preliminary site surveys for mining equipment. "They're moving forward as if they already own your property," Blake explained. "That suggests they're planning to take control through illegal means rather than continuing to negotiate." The surveillance footage was disturbing. Reese's team had brought in surveying equipment and was marking locations for what appeared to be heavy machinery. They were also taking detailed photographs of access roads and potential security vulnerabilities. "They're planning something big," Blake continued. "And based on our intelligence about their operations in other states, it's likely to involve destroying evidence of legitimate mineral deposits while establishing infrastructure for money laundering activities." Sheriff Rodriguez joined the planning sessions at the safe house, bringing local knowledge that complemented the FBI's resources. "These mountain roads can be controlled at several choke points," he explained, studying topographical maps of the area. "If we position units correctly, we can contain any attempt to bring in heavy equipment." But the most significant development came when Dr. Harrison contacted Margaret with urgent news about his survey findings. "I need to speak with Mr. Calloway immediately," he said. "We've discovered something that changes everything about the geological situation." Dr. Harrison arrived at the safe house that evening, carrying core samples and geological charts that he spread across the cabin's kitchen table. Agent Blake and Sheriff Rodriguez were present for the briefing, recognizing that any new discoveries would impact their tactical planning. "Mr. Calloway, our deep core samples have revealed something extraordinary," Dr. Harrison began. "The mineral formation extends much deeper than we initially believed, but more importantly, it's connected to a much larger geological system." He pointed to a detailed geological map showing mineral veins extending across several properties in the area. "This isn't just about your land anymore. The lithium and rare earth deposits extend onto at least 4 neighboring properties, creating what could be one of the largest mineral discoveries in Colorado history." Agent Blake leaned forward, recognizing the implications immediately. "How many people know about this extended formation?" "Just my team and now you. But Mr. Calloway, this discovery makes your property the key to a multi-billion-dollar mineral complex. Whoever controls your land controls access to the entire formation." The revelation explained why the criminal consortium was so determined to acquire Jebb's property, despite the risks of federal attention. They weren't just laundering money through a $12 million mining operation. They were potentially gaining control of mineral resources worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "This also explains their urgency," Margaret observed. "Once word of this discovery spreads, legitimate mining companies and government agencies will be fighting over development rights. The criminals need to establish control now, before the competition arrives." Agent Blake was already on her phone, coordinating with her superiors in Denver. The scope of the investigation had expanded far beyond a simple money laundering case into something that could affect national mineral security and international mining markets. That night, as Jebb lay awake in the unfamiliar bed, he found himself thinking about Marcus and the weight his brother had carried during those final months. Marcus had known about the larger mineral formation. Some of his notes suggested he'd suspected the deposits extended beyond their property, but he'd died before he could fully understand the implications. Buck was restless too, occasionally, getting up to check the windows and doors, as if sensing that danger was approaching. The bond between man and dog had deepened during their exile from the mountain, both of them yearning for the familiar rhythms of their simple life together. The next morning brought news that forced immediate action. The FBI's surveillance team reported that a convoy of heavy trucks had been spotted moving toward Jebb's property under cover of darkness. The vehicles were carrying mining equipment, but also what appeared to be construction materials for permanent structures. "They're not planning to negotiate anymore," Agent Blake announced during an emergency briefing. They're moving to take physical control of your property, probably planning to claim squatters' rights or forge ownership documents. Sheriff Rodriguez studied the surveillance reports with growing alarm. If they establish a physical presence on the property with heavy equipment, it becomes much harder to remove them without risking environmental damage or public safety. The moment of decision had arrived. Jeb could continue hiding in the safe house while criminals destroyed his family's legacy, or he could return to his mountain and fight for what was rightfully his. But fighting meant exposing himself to dangers that could cost him his life. Agent Blake outlined the FBI's tactical plan for retaking the property and arresting the criminal consortium. It involved coordinated raids on multiple locations, federal warrants for financial crimes, and the cooperation of mining industry experts to document the scope of the illegal operation. "Mr. Calloway, we need you to be the bait," Blake said bluntly. "Your return to the property will force them to show their hand, giving us the opportunity to catch them in the act of criminal trespass and probably much worse." Margaret objected. "Immediately. You're asking him to risk his life to make your case easier. There has to be another way." "There might be," Blake acknowledged, "but every day we wait gives them more time to establish their operation and destroy evidence. The window for stopping them is closing rapidly." Jeb looked around the room at the people who had become his allies in this fight. Agent Blake with her federal authority, Margaret with her legal expertise, Sheriff Rodriguez with his local knowledge, and Dr. Harrison with his scientific evidence. Each of them was asking him to trust their judgment in a situation where the stakes couldn't be higher. Outside the safe house windows, the Colorado mountains stretched toward the horizon, beautiful and eternal in their indifference to human struggles. Somewhere among those peaks was his cabin, his garden, his chickens, and the peaceful life he'd spent decades building. Buck whined softly and looked up at him with dark eyes that seemed to ask a simple question: "When are we going home?" The time for hiding was over. Tomorrow, Jeb Calloway would return to his mountain, and the battle for his family's legacy would begin in earnest. The morning mist hung thick in the mountain valleys as Jeb's truck wound its way up the familiar road toward home. Buck sat alert in the passenger seat, his ears pricked forward and his entire body tense with anticipation. After 5 days in the safe house, they were finally returning to their mountain, but neither of them harbored any illusions about what they might find there. Agent Blake's voice crackled through the radio, hidden beneath the truck's dashboard. "Overwatch 1 to Mountain Man. You're about 2 miles from the perimeter. Surveillance shows at least 6 individuals on your property, with heavy equipment staged near the mine entrance." Jeb keyed the radio with a steady hand. "Copy that, Overwatch. Buck and I are ready." The FBI's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Jeb would return to his cabin as if unaware of the criminal occupation, forcing the consortium to either reveal their illegal presence or attempt to intimidate him into leaving. Either action would provide legal justification for the coordinated raids that were already in position around the county. Margaret's voice came through a second radio frequency. "Jeb, remember, you're not trying to be a hero here. Just establish your presence and let law enforcement do their job." But as Jeb crested the final hill and saw his property spread out below, he realized that the situation had escalated far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The peaceful meadow surrounding his cabin had been transformed into what looked like a mining camp, complete with portable buildings, generators, and excavation equipment that had torn ugly scars in the mountain earth. The artifact that would define this confrontation was visible immediately. A large sign posted at the entrance to his property, claiming it was a consolidated mining operations site and warning trespassers to stay away. The audacity of criminals claiming ownership of his family's land filled Jeb with a cold fury that surprised him with its intensity. Buck began growling as they approached the cabin, his hackles rising as he sensed the wrongness of familiar territory. violated by strangers. The dog's instincts were sharp. This was no longer their peaceful home, but a battlefield where the rules of mountain hospitality no longer applied. 3 men emerged from the portable buildings as Jeb's truck approached, their postures aggressive and their hands positioned near concealed weapons. The leader was Vincent Reese, his expensive suit replaced by work clothes that did nothing to diminish the menace in his cold eyes. Jeb parked his truck directly in front of his cabin and stepped out slowly, keeping his hands visible, while Buck jumped down beside him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the violated landscape, and the sound of generators and heavy machinery created a mechanical discord that felt like violation of the mountain's natural rhythms. "Mr. Calloway," Reese called out, approaching with false confidence, "I'm afraid you're trespassing on an active mining operation. This property has been legally acquired by our consortium." Jeb felt a calm settle over him that he recognized from his younger years, when mountain life had taught him that some confrontations couldn't be avoided, only faced with dignity and courage. "Mr. Reese, this is my land, my cabin, and my home. You and your people are the ones who are trespassing." "I think you'll find our paperwork is in order," Reese replied, producing a folder of documents that looked official but which Jeb knew had to be forgeries. "We've filed all the appropriate claims with the county recorder's office." Agent Blake's voice whispered through Jeb's hidden earpiece. "Keep him talking. We need him to admit to criminal activity before we can move in." But before Jeb could respond, Buck suddenly bolted toward the mine entrance, barking with an urgency that Jeb had learned to trust implicitly. The dog had detected something that the humans had missed, and his behavior triggered an immediate shift in the dynamics of the confrontation. "Get that dog under control," one of Reese's men shouted, reaching for what was clearly a weapon concealed beneath his jacket. "Buck, come!" Jeb called, but the dog continued toward the mine, his barking becoming more frantic as he approached the excavation site. Reese's expression had changed from false confidence to genuine alarm. "Stop that animal immediately, or we'll stop him permanently." The threat against Buck dissolved the last of Jeb's restraint. "You touch my dog, and you'll answer to me personally, Mr. Calloway," Reese said, his voice taking on the cold edge that had probably intimidated dozens of other landowners. "You're interfering with a legitimate business operation. I suggest you collect your animal and leave before this situation becomes unpleasant. This is my property, and I'm not going anywhere." Reese nodded to his companions, and all 3 men began moving to surround Jeb in a coordinated maneuver that suggested military or security training. The morning air filled with tension as the confrontation moved toward violence. But Bucks continued. Barking from the mine entrance had attracted attention from other figures Jeb hadn't initially noticed. 4 more men emerged from the excavation site, and their appearance explained Buck's agitation. These weren't mining workers. They were armed guards whose job was clearly to prevent anyone from seeing what was happening in the mine tunnels. "Gentlemen," Agent Blake's voice suddenly boomed across the property through a powerful amplifier. "This is the FBI. You are all under arrest for criminal trespass, fraud, and violation of federal mining regulations." The mountain erupted in coordinated activity as FBI agents, sheriff's deputies, and state police emerged from concealment positions around the property. Helicopters appeared over the ridgeline, and the access road filled with law enforcement. Vehicles moving in perfect synchronization. Reese's reaction was immediate and violent. Instead of surrendering, he drew a concealed weapon and grabbed Jeb as a human shield, pressing the gun against his neck while backing toward the mine entrance. "Stay back!" Reese shouted to the advancing agents. "I'll kill him!" Buck's barking intensified as his master was threatened, and the dog began moving in a wide circle around Reese, looking for an opportunity to protect Jeb without endangering him further. Agent Blake appeared at the edge of the property with her weapon drawn, her voice calm but carrying absolute authority. "Mr. Reese, you're surrounded by federal agents. Release Mr. Calloway and surrender peacefully." "This property belongs to our consortium," Reese screamed, his composure finally cracking under the pressure. "We have millions of dollars invested in this operation. An operation built on forged documents and criminal conspiracy," Blake replied. "It's over, Mr. Reese. Don't make this worse than it already is." The standoff stretched across several tense minutes, with federal agents positioned in a careful perimeter that prevented escape while avoiding crossfire that might endanger Jeb. Buck continued circling, his loyalty to his master warring with his instinct to attack the man threatening him. Finally, Margaret's voice cut through the tension. From somewhere behind the FBI lines, "Mr. Reese, I'm Mr. Calloway's attorney. If you harm him, you'll face federal murder charges in addition to everything else. Is that really worth protecting a money laundering operation?" The mention of murder charges seemed to penetrate Reese's desperation, and Jeb felt the pressure of the gun against his neck ease slightly. In that moment of uncertainty, Buck made his move. Buck's attack was swift, silent, and perfectly calculated. The old blue-tick coonhound launched himself at Reese's gun hand with the precision of a working dog protecting his pack leader. 9 years of mountain life had kept Buck strong and agile, and his loyalty to Jeb overrode any concern for his own safety. Reese screamed as Buck's powerful jaws clamped down on his wrist, forcing him to drop the weapon as he stumbled backward. Jeb broke free immediately, rolling away from the struggle, while FBI agents converged on the scene with professional efficiency. "Buck, release!" Jeb commanded, and his faithful companion immediately obeyed, backing away from Reese while maintaining a protective stance between his master and the fallen criminal. Agent Blake was the first to reach Reese, her weapon trained on him as other agents secured the scene. "Vincent Reese, you're under arrest for kidnapping, assault with a deadly weapon, criminal conspiracy, and about 15 other federal charges." The artifact that emerged from this climactic moment was Buck's own collar. The worn leather band that had started this story now bore teeth marks from Reese's desperate attempt to fight off the dog's protective attack. More than just a piece of equipment, the collar represented the unbreakable bond between man and dog that had ultimately saved them both. As Reese was led away in handcuffs, Agent Blake coordinated the arrest of his associates and the systematic documentation of the illegal mining operation. The portable buildings contained sophisticated equipment for processing stolen minerals, along with financial records that confirmed the money laundering activities the FBI had suspected. "Mr. Calloway," Blake said as the immediate crisis subsided, "I need you to see what they were doing in your mine. It's going to make you angry, but you need to understand the scope of what we've stopped here." Sheriff Rodriguez joined them as they walked toward the mine entrance, where the criminals' excavation had revealed the extent of their destructive activities. The beautiful natural cave formations that had been part of the mine since Jeb's grandfather's time had been systematically destroyed, replaced by crude tunnels designed to access the most valuable mineral deposits as quickly as possible. "They weren't planning to mine this properly," Dr. Harrison explained as he emerged from documenting the damage. "They were strip mining the most accessible deposits while destroying everything else. In 6 months, they would have extracted maybe 20% of the actual mineral value while making the rest inaccessible forever." The environmental damage was staggering. Acid runoff from their crude processing had already begun contaminating the small creek that ran through Jeb's property, and their heavy machinery had carved permanent scars in the mountain landscape that would take decades to heal. But the most shocking discovery came when FBI forensic accountants began analyzing the financial records found in the portable buildings. The criminal consortium hadn't just been planning to launder money through Jeb's mine. They'd been using similar operations across the western United States to move hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal funds. "Mr. Calloway," Agent Blake said as the scope of the operation became clear, "your refusal to sell this property probably prevented one of the largest money laundering operations in recent federal history." These people were planning to use your mine as the hub for processing illegal funds from drug trafficking, arms dealing, and international terrorism financing. Margaret arrived as the arrests were being completed, her expression mixing relief with professional satisfaction. "Jeb, the federal prosecutor wants to meet with you next week. There's going to be a substantial reward for your cooperation in breaking up this criminal network." But Jeb was barely listening to talk of rewards and recognition. He was standing in the ruins of his peaceful mountain home, trying to reconcile the violated landscape with the sanctuary he'd spent decades building. The criminals had been stopped, but the damage to his property and his sense of security felt irreparable. Buck pressed against his leg, offering the silent comfort that had sustained their friendship through every challenge they'd faced together. The dog's presence reminded Jeb that what mattered most had survived the ordeal: their bond, their loyalty to each other, and their shared love for this mountain that had been temporarily violated but not permanently conquered. As the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh light on the industrial debris scattered across his property, Jeb made a decision that surprised everyone who heard it. "Agent Blake, I want to make sure this kind of thing never happens to anyone else. What can I do to help your investigation?" The answer came in the form of a proposal that would transform Jeb from victim to active participant in the fight against criminal mining operations. The FBI wanted his cooperation in a long-term investigation that would target similar criminal networks operating throughout the Mountain West. "Mr. Calloway, your property could become a model for legitimate, environmentally responsible mining that creates jobs and prosperity while protecting the natural landscape. Are you interested in being part of that solution?" For the first time in days, Jeb smiled. The battle for his mountain was over, but the war for protecting other families from similar crimes was just beginning, and this time he wouldn't be fighting alone. 6 months later, Jeb stood on his rebuilt porch, watching the sunrise paint the Colorado peaks in shades of gold and amber. The coffee in his hands was black and strong, served in the same chipped ceramic mug he'd used for 20 years. Some things, he'd learned, were worth preserving exactly as they were. Buck lay stretched across the wooden planks at his feet, his greying muzzle resting on massive paws. The old blue-tick coonhound bore a new leather collar now, this one custom-made with a small brass plate identifying him as a federal service dog in recognition of his role in stopping the criminal conspiracy. But to Jeb, Buck was simply the same loyal companion who'd shared his mountain life for 9 years and saved both their lives when it mattered most. The landscape around the cabin told a story of healing and renewal. Where the criminals had carved ugly scars in the mountain earth, new vegetation was beginning to take hold. The contaminated creek had been cleaned and restored by environmental specialists, and the mining equipment had been replaced by carefully planned infrastructure that respected the natural contours of the land. The artifact that had come to symbolize this transformation sat framed on Jeb's kitchen table, the partnership agreement with Rocky Mountain Resource Partners that had turned his property into a model for responsible mining operations. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been true to her word, designing an extraction process that would recover the valuable minerals while preserving the mountain's ecological integrity. The phone on the kitchen counter rang with its familiar, shrill sound, but now the calls brought news of legitimate business rather than threats and pressure. Margaret's voice carried satisfaction as she delivered the latest update on the federal investigation. "Jeb, the trial verdicts came in this morning. Vincent Reese got 25 years for racketeering, kidnapping, and money laundering. His associates received sentences ranging from 10 to 15 years. The federal prosecutor said your testimony was instrumental in securing the convictions. What about the other mining operations they were running? Shut down across 6 states with over 40 arrests and millions of dollars in illegal assets. Seized. The FBI estimates that your cooperation prevented nearly $500 million in money laundering activities. The scope of what they'd accomplished still amazed Jeb. His simple refusal to be intimidated had unraveled a criminal network that had operated with impunity for years, preying on isolated landowners who lacked the resources to fight back. Sheriff Rodriguez's weekly visits had become social occasions rather than security briefings. Tom would stop by to check on the legitimate mining operations and share coffee with Jeb, discussing everything from local politics to the changing character of mountain communities. The Rocky Mountain Partnership is bringing good jobs to the area, Tom reported during his most recent visit. 15 full-time positions so far, all for local people, with environmental safeguards that put most mining companies to shame. Sarah Chen had become the unofficial coordinator for the community's relationship with the mining operation, ensuring that local businesses benefited from the increased economic activity while maintaining the rural character that made Cedar Ridge special. Dr. Vasquez is planning to establish a geology education center here, Sarah had told Jeb during his last visit to town. High school students from around the state will come to learn about responsible mining practices. Your property is going to become famous for all the right reasons. The federal reward for Jeb's cooperation had been substantial, enough to secure his financial future while allowing him to maintain the simple lifestyle he preferred. He'd used part of the money to establish a scholarship fund for rural students pursuing careers in environmental science, ensuring that the next generation would be better equipped to protect the land they inherited. Henry Watkins had helped Jeb navigate the financial complexities of sudden wealth, structuring his investments to provide steady income while supporting causes that mattered to him. The Cedar Ridge Community Bank had benefited as well, becoming the primary financial institution for the mining operation and several related businesses. But the most meaningful change had been personal. The isolation that had once defined Jeb's mountain existence had been replaced by a network of relationships built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Margaret visited regularly, often bringing her teenage daughter to experience mountain life and learn about Buck's heroic role in the federal investigation. Dr. Harrison had become a frequent guest, using Jeb's property as a research site for studying sustainable mining techniques. The geological surveys continued, revealing new details about the mineral formation that extended across several properties in the region. Agent Blake stopped by occasionally, usually when she was in the area investigating other cases. The criminal consortium's activities had led to a specialized FBI task force focused on preventing similar operations, and Jeb's experience had become a case study in how communities could protect themselves from criminal exploitation. "Mr. Calloway," Blake had said during her last visit, "you've become something of a legend in federal law enforcement. Your refusal to be intimidated probably saved dozens of other families from similar crimes." As evening approached on this particular day, Jeb found himself thinking about Marcus and the weight his brother had carried during those final months. The estrangement that had divided them for 43 years seemed less important now than the family legacy they'd both fought to protect in their own ways. The mine was producing wealth that would benefit the community for generations, but it was also preserving the mountain's natural beauty for future families to enjoy. Marcus would have appreciated the irony. Their father's played-out mine had become the foundation for both prosperity and conservation. Buck stirred at Jeb's feet, lifting his head to study the mountain trails that had become familiar territory for both of them again. The dog's dark eyes held the same intelligence and loyalty that had drawn Jeb to him 9 years ago, but now they also held the confidence of an animal who'd proven his courage when it mattered most. Walking to the edge of his porch, Jeb looked out over the valley where lights were beginning to twinkle in the houses of Cedar Ridge. The community that had rallied to support him during his darkest hours was thriving, benefiting from the careful balance between progress and preservation that the mining partnership had achieved. Some folks spend their whole lives chasing dreams that never come true, Jeb reflected, remembering the words that had begun this journey. Others learn to find peace in unexpected blessings and the loyalty of those who stand beside them when storms threaten. At 72 years old, with his faithful dog Buck still by his side and his mountain home more secure than ever, Jeb Calloway had discovered that the greatest treasures weren't always buried in the ground. Sometimes they were found in the courage to stand up for what mattered, the wisdom to accept help when it was offered, and the grace to transform adversity into opportunity for others. The sun set behind the peaks in shades of red and gold, painting the sky with colors that reminded Jeb why he'd fallen in love with this mountain decades ago. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight was for simple gratitude and the peaceful knowledge that some battles, when fought for the right reasons, could change the world in ways that mattered. Buck yawned and settled back onto the porch planks, content in the knowledge that his master was safe and their mountain home was secure. For both of them, it had been a long journey from the morning when a faithful dog's curiosity had uncovered a secret that changed everything. But they'd faced every challenge together, and they'd emerged stronger for the experience. The mountain that had witnessed 3 generations of Calloway dreams was finally at peace, protecting both its mineral treasures and its natural beauty for generations yet to come. And sometimes Jeb thought, as he scratched Buck's ears in the gathering twilight, that was the most valuable legacy of all.